Russia has been at war with Ukraine for over 35 months, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We're starting with scenes from western Russia's Kursk region. Over there, the 82nd Airborne Brigade of the Ukrainian army has now released images from their offensive in recent days. 3 villages were recaptured, once again recaptured by the Russian army in Russia. And that's the way the whole thing began. Here we can observe a bridge-laying vehicle of the Ukrainian army. And we see here that this bridge has been destroyed either by Ukrainians or by Russians. But the major surprise the Russians encountered afterwards was this tank used for bridge laying that made this river passable again for the Ukrainian army. And after it became passable, as we can see here now, at least 4 or even 5 armored vehicles of the Ukrainians drove across there to the east of Sudzha and have now commenced efforts to reclaim territory that had been previously lost over the course of the past few months. At present, we can observe how the tanks are carefully maneuvering across the expansive snowy fields. We also continuously observe how the impacts are occurring on both their left and right sides. It seems the Russians didn't lay mines, likely because they aimed to advance further in this direction and avoided placing their own mines here. Now we see the Ukrainian vehicles approaching. One of the 3 villages is visible in the background. I think you can somewhat make out the road here, and this is the wooded area that they want to occupy, because the Ukrainians don't want to move into the half-destroyed houses. They want to reoccupy the positions, the trenches, which they lost to the Russians in the past months, and they are succeeding in doing so. We now see how, one by one, the armored vehicles are dropping off the soldiers here. We repeatedly see heavy explosions to the left and right of it. Here we see it very close to the infantry fighting vehicle, but then we see the Ukrainians getting out. And they indeed have quite a bit of material with them. We see that they all carry large bags with them, with food, with ammunition, which are to be deposited there to establish a foothold once more. We can now see new explosions nearby. Here on the left side, we see artillery. Very few Ukrainians were injured by strikes here. Everyone makes an effort to keep moving, and then they gradually get into this position one by one. We observe that the Russian fire is extremely precise, so it hits very nearby. Nonetheless, at the end of this battle, where the Ukrainians definitely lost men as well, we also saw Russian footage that showed us that some of the vehicles were destroyed, which of course isn't shown in the Ukrainian footage here. So this is PR footage from the brigade that conducted it. The Ukrainians have just recaptured 3 villages southeast of Sudzha and approached the town of Ulyanok, held by the Russians again, and has thereby eased the pressure significantly. From Sudzha itself, the only city that Ukraine has occupied here in western Russia since August 6th last year. Sudzha basically serves as the regional hub, essentially functioning as the focal point of the Ukrainian conquest in the area of Kursk. And there was already an increasing fear that the Russians had advanced to within nearly a kilometer's distance from Sudzha, that you have to fight directly for the city here and then accordingly retreat back to Ukraine. This has now been proactively addressed by conducting new conquests in this region, making it clear to the Russians that despite their substantial deployment of Russian infantry forces, but also North Korean infantry with up to 12,000 troops deployed. As per South Korean reports, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 have been killed or wounded, rendering them unable to continue fighting. Despite all that, there is still a strong presence considering the possibly upcoming negotiations soon. We know the Munich Security Conference starts tomorrow in the Bavarian capital. Negotiations are supposed to happen there too, initially without Russia, but between Ukraine and its supporters. So they really want to keep this peace in Western Russia, and Ukraine is also very successful with that. Despite there being only about 450 square kilometers left under control, she has made it impossible for Russia and Putin, despite the massive deployment of foreign mercenaries, to take back this area. Let's have another brief look at the map to understand the situation we just encountered. It was an advance originating from Sudzha, which means it was coming from over here, following this road in the direction headed towards Ulyanok. The armed forces of Ukraine have advanced this far, and we can see that it looks relatively small here, but if we look at it up there, it's about 4 or 5 kilometers that Ukraine has advanced there and that they had to advance through Russian lines. And the Russians were actually ready to attack Sudzha. They had prepared with their own men, with their own tanks to attack there. However, they were surprised when the river was crossed where the bridge was actually destroyed. This mechanized attack that not only soldiers, like on the Russian side, we've repeatedly seen attacks from Plekovo over the same river in the past few days, but only by soldiers without armored vehicles, indicating that Ukraine can now suddenly conduct a mechanized attack in this area, utilizing soldiers in conjunction with infantry fighting vehicles as well as armored vehicles to traverse this river. The Russians didn't see the 80-second surprise coming as we observed. The Ukrainian army's Airborne Brigade has been very successful here and, as mentioned, has initially relieved the pressure from Sudzha. Parallel to this, Ukraine also carried out actions which we do not want to omit. So here at Malaya Lochna, they've pushed forward westward once again, and this is also an important part of the overall picture here. In the far west of the area are where the Russians managed to advance to the outskirts of Svetlikovo or the edge of Sverdlikovo. That means they continue their advance in this area. However, this is relatively insignificant when compared to Sudzha and Malaya Lochna, which are larger and more significant locations with industrial relevance, featuring railway tracks with the large prison of Kursk being also located in Malaya Lochna. That is still under Ukrainian control. This means the Russians are advancing in some areas where the Ukrainians haven't focused as much. In that case, we see it roughly 20 kilometers further northwest. Nevertheless, all in all, the Ukrainians still have a relatively stable situation in Kursk and have also shown with these recent attacks that they are well capable of increasing the pressure from their side and not merely waiting for the Russians who intend to continue advancing there. From western Russia, we move to eastern Ukraine, taking a look at the Donetsk region. And there too, as we mentioned yesterday, the Ukrainians have achieved something in recent days that they hadn't accomplished since the fall of 2023. They've successfully managed to push back the Russian forces. They've started engaging in some smaller counterattacks, which, to clarify, isn't quite a full offensive yet, and have effectively managed to liberate parts of at least 3 villages from the Russians. Strategically extremely important localities, as they crucially provide access to the Ukrainian-held major city of Pokrovsk. We're watching a video detailing an attempted Russian counteroffensive in the vicinity of Kotlin. Kotlin is actually one of the 3 villages in this particular region that the Ukrainians managed to partially liberate. And we can also see from these recordings that they're quite desperate. We've had the situation here before that the Russians have very, very few tanks and armored personnel carriers in this region after they lost hundreds there. And what they're doing here at this moment is a counterattack, a mechanized counterattack at that, and not just with infantry forces, but with a very limited amount of tanks, a BTR-82 from its own army, and now it gets interesting, with an M113 personnel carrier from the Ukrainians, which was previously captured and is now being used against them. So only these 2 vehicles are supposed to bring the change in Kotlin. As we will observe, the entire assault by the Russians gets crushed by the Ukrainians. The M113 is nearing the cemetery. You can see it clearly on the left side. This is Kotlin Cemetery, and we even have slightly different views, so to speak. So the Ukrainians are looking at various kamikaze drones, but also surveillance drones. By directly observing the events, they can precisely discern where the Russian forces are moving and can respond effectively, which is likely to lead to a disaster and a significant complete loss for the Russian army. We are now seeing, as I mentioned, the 2 vehicles. This is the M113, and it's now driving over a mine at the edge of the cemetery. We are now watching as the first Russians make their way out. However, this vehicle is subsequently under attack using artillery shelling. Look at it. Here we see it hit by artillery, especially cluster munitions. Now you can see it quite well. It's so strong that not a single Russian survives it. Now we have solid impacts, and now we can clearly see it. I hope you can recognize here these precise circular impacts. Here lies the Russian vehicle surrounding the cemetery, which leads to the unfortunate reality that the entire infantry, those who managed to escape and survive the initial explosion, are now being killed here. We also need to pixelate the whole thing, of course. The Ukrainians reinforced it again. Ironically, right next to the graves of Ukrainian civilians, the killed Russian soldiers now lie here, next to their M113, which was from Ukraine and delivered by the USA. As mentioned, sadly, none survived here. Now we have the BTR-82, which drove by, moving a bit further south. Here we observe him advancing towards Kotlin, yet he's already ablaze at this moment, struck by several kamikaze drones, and then utterly obliterated along with his entire crew, before he reaches Kotlin. Here we see it from the perspective, as mentioned, we have different perspectives. So, the BTR-82, and here's the first street from Kotluna. This is where the troops are supposed to be dropped off. However, the whole thing doesn't succeed. We see there, trying to slip through somehow, but keeps getting hit by various kamikaze drones. And in the end, the fire is so big that the entire vehicle is destroyed, so that's the situation here again, clearly visible. So, that was the target that was just liberated by the Ukrainians. There are presumably also Ukrainian soldiers there holding the position who really have to rely on the drone units. That they managed to stop the Russian attackers here in time, and indeed at the last moment, the second and final vehicle of this Russian counterattack on Kotlin was destroyed, thus turning the tide of danger away from the Ukrainian soldiers in the village itself. We'll look at it on the map, seeing the situation at Pokrovsk, which was extremely difficult for the Ukrainian army. Not only was there a frontal assault from the east, that was feared, which indeed was held off for a long time. From here, from the direction of Hrodivka and Novohrodivka, it was held back. Then, in recent months, the Russians tried to flank the whole thing and got relatively close, until we see it up there about 5 kilometers from Pokrovsk in front of the southern districts of Pokrovsk. And right around this area, this Ukrainian mini counter-offensive is currently taking place, if you want to put it that way. You can clearly see the blue area here. There's the blue section over there, that's Dekna, and right across from it is Peshane. And what we just observed was, in fact, the attempt of a Russian counter-offensive maneuver. Perhaps we could, in this case, mark it with green. That was the attempt of the Russian counterattack on Kotlin, which was then stopped here by the Ukrainian army. And thus, the Ukrainians can alleviate the pressure by deploying their own vehicles coming out from Pokrovsk naturally. And of course, there are casualties on the Ukrainian side every day as well. But it would have been much worse if the Russians had succeeded in getting so close to Pokrovsk, or also here towards western-bound road E50 to approach, which cuts into the city. In that sense, an extremely important move and counterstrikes here by the Ukrainian army. A little further south, specifically near Andriivka, the situation becomes even more extreme and challenging for the Ukrainian forces. Let's start by examining the map in detail to better understand how everything is set up in this particular area. Once more, we're seeing a somewhat partial cauldron scenario. It's essentially a U-shaped formation strategically moving towards the Ukrainian forces' positions. Kind of like an upside-down U, if you will. Dakhny is still being held by the Ukrainians. And Andriivka, as a larger settlement, has now been almost entirely taken over by the Russian army. And we can observe that there are 2 settlements in between. One is a small one, which we haven't marked on this map, but there's a larger one called Konstantinopil. Additionally, we can clearly see the distance to the Russian line. That implies the distance to Andreevka and also heading towards the south. And those distances are each just about 3 or 4 kilometers. This effectively places Konstantinopil completely in the sights of the Russian fiber optic drones, which we discussed over the past few days, which can now keep flying continuously, even up to 20 kilometers. But those 3 to 4 kilometers are absolutely no problem. And thus we also have footage from Konstantinopil showing how the Russians are using their fiber optic drones to hunt down Ukrainian vehicles. Here we have another M113 dot. Moving in this partially destroyed but not completely destroyed village, on the left we can also see the playground. And this vehicle was already left behind here. Maybe there was a previous attack and now the Russians are flying their fiber optically guided kamikaze drones one after another into this area. As mentioned, there's the playground visible up front and a small lake here. And the first drone has already caused a fire there, and now the second drone is also approaching this M113. Thus, it continues to be extremely hazardous for the Ukrainians to get close to the frontline area. And when this M113 vehicle approaches within 3 or 4 kilometers and faces the difficult situation we've seen where the Russians are advancing in the north and south, creating a sort of, defending such a U, an open U-shaped area is extremely difficult for the Ukrainians. And there are also many opportunities for the Russian army to approach this location from different directions, east, north and south, and strike here with their kamikaze drones. And we'll look at 2 videos to see that the Russian army continues to try to strike, at least try to advance. From Yampolivka, a small locality positioned at the very center of the front line, within the heart of the Donetsk region, situated slightly to the north of both Toretsk and Bakhmut. Here we see Russian soldiers once again attempting to advance on Yampolivka with 2 vehicles, but again it's roughly, about 20 infantrymen and 2 vehicles. Once again, this attack ends in complete disaster. The Ukrainians are still in Yampolivka, while slightly further north in Terny, the Russian army has already gained a foothold and is trying to advance from here. We see repeated impacts occurring here and the whole thing, to some extent, can be shown. After that, it must be blurred, showing Ukrainian kamikaze drones hitting the full troop carriers. In this case, it's an infantry fighting vehicle with tracks. Hitting, and they are really full of infantrymen. That means they stretched a kind of cage over here, and in the back, they also put something like a cage over it, and perhaps you can see it. Right behind them, there are about 10 Russian soldiers per armored vehicle, which, in the event of a direct hit, in the case of a very precise hit by Ukraine, we know that sometimes these kamikaze drones may not work properly. It's very dangerous. Now, from a different angle, we can guess that among the soldiers seen earlier, likely 5 to 7 unfortunately died. Whoever survives and whoever jumps out are the crew, meaning those who are in the front are trying to get to safety, trying to get out. When we've observed the mass of soldiers packed in the vehicle and then see only 1 or 2 moving out and running away, we can clearly see the extent of the damage it has caused. The Ukrainians then carry out an attack on this armored column. We have just witnessed how the cluster munitions are effectively used. We have heavy artillery. Now we keep seeing this. I hope you can recognize it again and again, these circular impacts from 30, 40, 50 small bomblets coming down here. Cluster munitions being used deliberately against infantry, targeted once it's deployed. Both the tank and the infantry fighting vehicle are currently burning. The attack on Yampolivka is indeed a strong one, and it is a good attack ending in disaster for Russia. And that's something you have to keep reminding yourself. The Russians have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men deployed, but for someone losing between 100 and 200 men every day, they just can't keep advancing forever. And the Russians also have to try to mobilize. They're not doing it with a forced mobilization, but they're issuing contracts instead. You earn about 3,000 euros a month when you fight in Ukraine, plus you get these approximately 50, sometimes even 70,000 euros as a signing bonus, because the Russian military knows that people assume they will die. That means you get the money anyway, even if you get killed relatively quickly. And we see why that is, namely because there are very, very large losses. The situation with the vehicles is getting worse and worse for the Russian army, and we can also see that in the next video. This is a video that you can hardly imagine is actually reality. Allegedly the second most powerful army in the world. Up here we see 3 vehicles approaching a Ukrainian position, and all 3 are civilian vehicles, so vehicles which is simply taken from regular road traffic. Here you can see it again, I'll try to show it again. Here we have the first, here the second, and here the third one. There is no armor at all, they're just regular vehicles where even the doors have been removed for faster getting in and out, and the Russian soldiers, 4 to 5 soldiers per vehicle, are meant to advance with them. When we understand that, we can clearly see the Russians, after losing at least 10,000, probably closer to 20,000 military vehicles in Ukraine, are left with quite a modest arsenal now that they are trying to advance with it. Now we see the 3 vehicles again, and the problem is, of course, when moving with civilian vehicles in a military area, especially in such rough terrain, any contact with either a kamikaze drone or a mine results in a total loss of the vehicle, and thus also a total loss of the military vehicles. Also the infantrymen being transported with it. We're seeing that now. Pretty intense footage. The first vehicle is now hit by a mine and immediately catches fire and burns instantly. We are aware it's likely all soldiers inside, approximately 4 to 5, were killed or badly wounded. We then have the scenario where 2 of the vehicles are still on the move. Again, the first one likely hits a drone. The explosion is a bit higher up, and we can also see here the absolute damage being done. And now we have one last vehicle that continues to move, which is now being tracked by the Ukrainian surveillance drone, wanting to see, of course, where it is going. Here we can observe that the Russians appear a bit disoriented, moving off in various directions. We are still having impacts, some missing their targets, but soon enough that place will surely be reached. And from there we have to cut and pixelate a lot, because we are seeing the situation again here. We probably have 2 to 3 soldiers in the front. In the back we have 3 soldiers sitting on it, so that means 5 to 6 soldiers are in this vehicle. And we can now observe that there's also a successful hit on the last vehicle the Russians made use of. And we then observe that approximately half of the crew or the transported soldiers are already facing death at this particular point. And then we cut it all away because the Ukrainians, of course, won't stop hunting down the last survivors here. Until that point, the entire Russian offensive, once again, the complete Russian attack involving 3 civilian vehicles and up to 20 soldiers, was effectively stopped and destroyed. Meanwhile, the Russian military does not merely rely on these civilian or even rather simplistic maneuvers. There's also sophisticated high-tech equipment being deployed, which we will take a closer look at right now. We have recently obtained new video footage depicting a Lancet attack targeting a Ukrainian unit. Yes, it's propaganda too. We see it top right. That's the Russian army's symbol, which the Ministry of Defense proudly uses, pretending as if that's the normal. We just saw what the truth is, namely that all Russian soldiers deployed die. And now we are witnessing an attack taking place here on a team operating Ukrainian drones. Down here the drone is actively being prepared, and shortly we'll see a white vehicle, inside which the drone team is stationed. It's probably a surveillance drone equipped with long-range capabilities. We're observing this white van now. Next is the approach of the Sala Lancet kamikaze drone with about a 70-kilometer range. All of this inevitably results in losses on the Ukrainian side, something that is not a secret. We are now able to observe the drone approaching from the bottom right corner, and subsequently we also witness the impact occurring. And this most likely results in the unfortunate and regrettable loss of a portion of the drone team involved. Yet, it's crucial to point out that these are indeed the images Russia spreads. That's how this war is being portrayed, as a high-tech war, as a clean war where one is superior because of air superiority, but the reality is quite different. What we just saw, that now sometimes civilian vehicles have to be used because there are not enough tanks and armored vehicles available for mobilization in the attacks anymore. And indeed, it's happening that the Russian army finds itself sometimes even being pushed back. Let's take a look at one last video that Ukraine has released in order to also explore another part of the country. Here we are now in Kherson, which is located in the south of the country, specifically in the city of Oleshki. We can clearly see how Russian soldiers are staying at a railway crossing, and we also notice that trains used to run along there. Here's something akin to a tunnel, and the Russians are utilizing it as a shelter to position themselves near the Dnieper River, to regroup strategically to establish a foothold there. However, we now see that the Ukrainians are deploying a French-made AASM-250 bomb. Here we see it in the daylight again, the entire scene before us. So apologies, it's not a railway line, but rather a highway. It's essentially a highway bridge without any underpass for them to hide in. And now we're witnessing how the Ukrainians, making use of bombs supplied by France and attached to their own MiG-29, a Soviet-era fighter jet, are actively carrying out strategic attacks against the Russians entrenched in their bunkers. Attacked there, why are these MiG-29s primarily deployed in Kherson in the south? While another impact can be observed here, there's less anti-aircraft defense, and you don't need to fly along the front for so long to reach the eastern part of the country, but is able to approach the front line rapidly from the more secure airports in the western and central parts of the country, thus facilitating a swift and effective attack. As mentioned earlier, this specific combination of Soviet-built MiG-29s, which have been partially donated by Western allies, along with these advanced French bombs, once again results in a situation where a group of Russian soldiers attempting to conceal themselves in this area, which is near the banks of the Dnieper and therefore also close to the city of Kherson, the provincial capital, which is under Ukrainian control, so that this group can be defeated by the Ukrainian army. And so the war continues not only in the west of Russia, but also in the east and south of Ukraine.